Are you curious about the unknown, the unexplainable? Do you find yourself intrigued by the mysterious and paranormal side of our world? Join us on an adventure into the world of inexplicable discoveries and investigations that may someday give us a final answer as to what may be behind the veil of reality. Then it's time to turn your pods up, because we're live to tape from the mountains of West Virginia. It's time once again for Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. The universe is waiting for you.
Live to tape from the mountains of West Virginia, it's another episode of Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. Thank you for taking this journey with me. On this episode of Let's Find Out, our guest is an author that started his journey beginning with a UFO encounter at the age of 4 that has led him to be fascinated by all things paranormal ever since that moment. This experience and his passion to research, investigate, write, and share extraterrestrial encounters has brought us such great works as Granite Skies, A Disconcerted Journey Through the Unknown, Otherworldly Encounters, Evidence of UFO Sightings and Abductions, and the I Want to Believe podcast. All this plus more. Please welcome to Let's Find Out a new friend to our show, author and podcaster Nomar Slevik. Nomar, my friend, welcome to Let's Find Out. Thank you for being here tonight with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things when I read the short bio that you sent me and I did some research on you. Normally, and if you don't mind, we could start at how it began, because I don't want to be that generic podcast of how did this get started and stuff like that. But I feel that your story is very important because you're the first person, one of the few people that I know that had an encounter with a UFO so early in life. Whereas I've met other people, especially even in my family, were not extraterrestrial, but mostly paranormal type, where it started at a very young age. Is that something that's common at that age for an extraterrestrial experience?
It can be. I would say it's a commonality. It's certainly not everyone, but there are a lot of folks that tend to have experiences as children. They don't always remember them, or it might take them quite some time into their adulthood for them to remember them. But yeah, it is something that happens. I've also found that sometimes, I don't want to say more often than not, but a lot of times, it also runs in the family. And that might not be a thing that's really known from family member to family member until they start talking about it, and it could be years later and they start finding out things. When it comes to me and doing my research and interviewing people, I find that stuff like that through my questions will come out, and it's interesting to see that it comes out more than I thought would happen.
Well, and if you don't mind, let's go back to age 4. If you could paint us the landscape, how did it start?
Sure. Like you said, I was quite young, and I was asleep, and it was the middle of the night. But when you're 4 years old, I don't know if that was 10 p.m. or 3 a.m., but a loud bang woke me up, and I kind of was looking around for some sort of explanation when I started to hear this light tapping on my windows. And so I looked at them, and I started to see that the sky was lighting up, and I started to hear more booms, and I realized it was a thunder and lightning storm. So I decided to kneel up on my bed and kind of look out the window and watch the thunder and lightning storm. And at the time, I lived in Fort Kent, Maine, and Fort Kent is way at the tip of Maine. It's right across the river from Canada, and the St. John River was right in front of my house, and it was raging outside, and in the sky it was all dark, and I was seeing the little lines of electricity from lightning. And as I'm watching this, there's this really jarring lightning bolt. Like if I were to ask you to draw a lightning bolt, you would draw this jagged yellow line. That's how I perceived it as a kid, and it's how I remember it as an adult. But this jagged yellow line was stuck in a cloud. And even at 4 or 5 years old, I knew that you saw electricity just for a split second, less than a second, But this was staying there. and there was electricity coming off of it, and there was more booms. And then I'm not sure what else happened. I just remember like falling asleep and waking up the next morning. I go to the bathroom, and I'm walking back to my bedroom, and the lightning bolt is still there. And I'm like, that's crazy. I got to go tell my dad. So I ran downstairs, and I grabbed my dad, and I brought him all the way upstairs. I don't know why we didn't just go outside, but I brought him all the way upstairs to look out my window, and it was gone. And I tried explaining to him what I experienced the night before with the storms and the lightning bolt and all that stuff. And he was doing what adults do when a kid is trying to tell them something crazy. And he was like, okay, buddy, and kind of patted my head. But I think I must have been like pretty insistent, because he kind of had to like kneel down, get on my level, put his hands on my shoulders, and was like, buddy, it didn't rain last night at all. Like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. And I wasn't scared or anything, because I didn't know anything, and it was just confusing. So, being a 4 or 5 year old, we're like squirrels, so the next thing caught my attention and I forgot all about it. Fast forward 2 weeks, and my dad's waking me up in the middle of the night, and he brings me downstairs, and I see my sister's there. She's all dressed up in her winter gear, and my mom starts manhandling me and puts me in my coat and ski pants and stuff. And my dad picks me up, and I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, you got to come outside and see this. So we all go outside, and it's freezing. Northern Maine in winter is ridiculous, So now we're on our front lawn, and my head is buried in my dad's chest. And he's telling me to look up. Like, buddy, you got to look up, look up. So I finally take my head out of his chest, and I look up, and I see this like kaleidoscope, if you will, of greens and blues and I think reds maybe. But what I was witnessing was the Northern Lights. It's the only time I've ever seen it. And I can remember it like that lightning bolt. So those two things happening at such a young age, I think created some core memories and told me that weird shit happens in the sky and I should probably pay attention, And ever since then I have been.
And there goes a time to where I want to say I don't think it's done on purpose, where you bury these memories and they come out later on in life. Was there a gap, a memory gap, until you remember it again, or is it just something you chose to deal with later on?
It's something that I recalled later on in life. So when I was like 8 or 9 years old, I started watching horror movies. I got my horror movie obsession from my mother. And I think the first horror movie I ever watched was Phantasm. And they have these little silver balls, they're like the size of a Christmas ornament, but they have like this deadly blades on them, and they fly by themselves, throughout this mortuary or whatever the hell it is. And that silver thing really reminded me of like, I don't know what, but I was fascinated by it. And because she got me into horror movies, I was kind of into like all things spooky. And she would tell me some ghost stories that would happen to her at her house when she was growing up. And that always fascinated me. And I started asking friends and other family members, have you ever seen a ghost? Have you ever seen a UFO? You ever seen a Bigfoot or, anything like that? And most of the stories I got were like ghost stories type stuff. But as I was asking people about this stuff, I was like, wait a minute. I think I saw a UFO. And I told my mom about it. I was like, do you remember at all when I was 4 or 5 years old and we were living in Fort Kent at the time, and I saw this lightning bolt that was like stuck in a cloud? And she was like, what are you talking about? No, not at all. And I had watched an Unsolved Mysteries, and they played a segment about the Allagash abductions, which is this pretty famous alien abduction scenario that happened in Maine, but it had received national attention. And I watched it on Unsolved Mysteries, and I'm like, wow, other people from Maine are experiencing like UFO stuff? Like, this is crazy. And it was blowing my young mind. And I kind of kept that with me into my teenage years, and I was just constantly trying to collect as many paranormal stories as possible that ran the gamut. I didn't care what it was, just as long as it was weird, you know. And collecting all those stories for quite some time. Once I got into my like early 20s and mid 20s, I started really organizing these stories and thinking maybe I might be able to do something with these stories, because it felt to me as though it was like some important historical record, you know, a record of the strange, if you will, you know. And I thought it made sense to catalog this stuff in some way. Now, while I was growing up, I would, whenever we had book fairs at school, I would try to buy as many books as that I could afford, you know, about, you know, strange phenomenon. You know, I had books on the Bermuda Triangle and Loch Ness Monster, and
Yeah, me too.
yeah. And obviously UFOs. And one thing I found about UFO books, a lot of the ones that I experienced growing up, and I won't name any names, but a lot of them read like textbooks. And they were just a slog to get through. And I didn't want to do that, you know. And so what I did with these stories was I almost wrote them as if they were like a novelization of the story. So there would be no embellishment of the story at all. But what I would do is I would talk about the town that it happened in. And I would talk about what the town is known for and what these people did in their lives. And then how that, while they're just trying to live their lives, this extraordinary encounter happened. And then I would talk about the aftermath of the encounter, trying to round out this whole story, as opposed to here's this little blurb, or here's all this technical jargon about nuts and bolts UFO or disclosure, all this stuff, where I was just mostly cared about the story and the experiencer themselves, you know.
You know, and I was, as you were speaking, something comes to mind is one of your books. Is I was doing some research, and I know we're kind of jumping a little bit ahead,
That's okay.
but I feel it's very important. Otherworldly Encounters.
Yeah.
You know, you covered a wide variety of events. You know, you got crop circle, abductions, monsters, and things of this of like that. When you interview people to get their stories, and I can understand where an event like this or an experiencer, it can be quite emotional in a way.
Sure.
How do they approach you, and how do you talk to somebody who has such a extraordinary event in their life, something life changing like this?
Yeah, I would say nowadays, a lot of people, you know, will send me a message or email me, and so the stories kind of come to me more often than not now at this point in my career. But beforehand, and I still do this now, is I scour Google and I scour newspapers.com and to find old stories, to find news stories. And also social media has been a huge impact in regards to people reporting their encounters. So I belong to several different groups on in social media where people do report stuff. And if I come across something interesting, I will reach out to the person and see if they're interested in talking about it. And sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. And, you know, whatever they want, that's fine with me, you know. In regards to talking to somebody with such usually a life-changing event, really it just comes down to being a good listener and being non-judgmental. And that's, I don't know, it's in my opinion, that's easy. Also, something I've noticed in ufology, not all people, but a lot of researchers don't handle an experiencer with care. A lot of them, not a lot, but some researchers are just looking for that story and may disregard the experiencer afterwards, or might not, you know, follow up with them afterwards or something like that. And I don't like that. And I think that sucks. So while I'm not best friends with every experiencer that I interview, I do make sure to handle them with care and with kindness and no judgment, and that I am open to you contacting me again should anything happen, or if you just need to talk. And that's happened numerous times. A new event occurred. I don't instantly think, oh, I need to write about this too. I'm just like, okay, how can I help? And oftentimes they're just like, I just need somebody to tell. I'm like, okay, well, I'm here for that, And so that's how a lot of that goes. I hope that answers the question.
It does, because I believe confession is good for the soul, because
Yeah.
sometimes it's a matter of telling the right person your experience that can pretty much understand it. In your case, I think you can relate to their experiences.
Sure.
So, without naming names, of course, can you give us a glimpse into one of the stories that have been shared in your books?
Yeah, so one story is about this woman who lived in Western Maine. And this happened in like the mid 90s. She was married at the time and had 2 teenage children. And it was a little before 9 o'clock, and the parents were going upstairs to like get ready for bed and lay in bed and watch a movie. And the kids were going to watch a movie themselves downstairs on the couch. Well, mom's getting ready for bed, and dad sees this light outside. And he's like, that's not the moon. Like, what the hell's that light? She kind of hears him going on about it. So she comes, sticks her head out the bathroom's got a toothbrush in her mouth. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? He's like, you got to come see this light. So she walks over to the window, looks at it, and is like, whoa, what the hell is that? And they described it as like this round, large, bright object that kind of looked like the moon and was high up like the moon, but also big. And they're like, let's go outside and get a better look at it. Like, okay, so they go down the stairs, and now they're in the living room, and the kids turn around. They see that mom and dad are going outside. So they're like, what the hell are you doing? They're like, oh, there's this crazy light outside. You got to come see it. So the kids are like, okay. So all 4 of them pile outside. They're on the front porch, and from the where the UFO was, or the bright light was, from their vantage point on the porch where the UFO was, they had to look to their extreme right. So all 4 of them were kind of like leaning over the railing and looking at this weird light in the sky, when all of a sudden it zooms to like right in front of the house, and it's lower in the sky now. And they're all looking at it like gobsmacked. And they're like, well, what the hell is this? And then after a moment, it just blinked out. And they're kind of like, wow, well, that was crazy. Well, it's getting cold. Let's get back inside. They walk in, and the kids go, hey, the movie's over. And mom's like, what are you talking about? That's the credits from the movie that was just on. Your movie's going to start in a second. They're like, no. The movie's over. What time is it? And so mom goes in the kitchen and looks at the stove and looks at the time. And it's 11 p.m. Wow. So the entire family lost 2 hours of time. And they didn't know what to make of it. They talked about it a little bit, but really they just had to live with the strangeness of it. They never tried to figure out what happened with that missing time. And this was, in the 90s, and I talked to this person, in 2017. So they held on to it for quite some time. And they also shared with me a lot of other things that had happened throughout her life. And one of the last things that we talked about, she was sitting there, and her eyes had teared up, and she's like, I just want to know why me. And of course I didn't have a good answer. So I told her, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that somebody else might be going through something similar, and they can't talk about it, but they will read your story and maybe not feel so alone. And that kind of helped her. Like she appreciated the sentiment, although I couldn't answer her question, But yeah, that's an example of a story, talking to somebody. Now, another story where I wasn't involved with interviewing anybody, but was just part of my research. I was on newspapers.com, and I was searching for UFO stories, and I found one from Fairfield, Maine, back in 1965. And this encompassed an entire class and their teacher. So it was about 9:30 in the morning, and one of the students, his name was Paul, he was sitting, during a lesson, the teacher's talking, and he hears this weird beeping noise coming from outside, and it was loud. So he just kind of, abandoned his studies and walked right up to the window and was looking out the window to see what the hell the sound was. And he said he sees this black dot way off in the distance, and it seems like the beeping sound is coming from that black dot, and it's getting closer and it's getting closer, and as it's getting closer, it's looking like this oblong silver thing, and it's getting lower and closer to the school. So he kind of like gasped and stepped back a little bit. So the whole class is looking at him, and the teacher's looking at him, and they all get up and go to the window. And when they're all at the window with the teacher, this silver disc goes by the window and keeps descending, and it appears to land behind somebody's house or something. They couldn't see it after it got a little too low. So the class was all abuzz talking about this, and the teacher's like, what the hell? So she calls the principal, or goes and gets the principal, and he comes to the room, and she explains what's going on. The kids are all kind of like clamoring at him, telling him what's going on. So he's like, okay, hold on. And he starts to sequester some of the kids, and he starts interviewing them. Like, okay, what'd you see? And he was trying to sequester them so they wouldn't talk with each other, So he gets about 10 kids saying all similar things, where they saw this oval-shaped object, and it was silver, and it had a little antenna sticking out the front, and there was a blinking light on top, and there was this thing on the bottom, like this black center thing on the bottom, and it was beeping, and he asked them to draw it, so they all drew it on the chalkboard. So the principal decides to call the local newspaper and ask if anybody had reported any UFO sightings. And they said, that's strange that you ask, because yeah, somebody did. So a railroad worker in the next town over was outside working on the railroad, and he heard this beeping sound, and he looks up and he sees this black dot fly over. A couple minutes later, he hears a beeping sound again, and he sees a bigger black dot fly over. And this keeps happening in 2 or 3 minute intervals. And the object keeps getting bigger every time he looks up and it flies over, to the point where he sees this silver oblong thing. And he described it looking like the bottom of a teacup, because his perspective is underneath it. So the person at that he's on the phone with at the newspaper asks if a reporter can come and talk to him and to the kids. And he said, sure. So the reporter comes, he tells them everything. And the reporter even takes pictures of the kids next to their chalk drawings of the UFO. And the people in the town really didn't create a lot of buzz. The police were never contacted. The story just kind of lived and died within that small community. And it's just a tiny mention in a newspaper that I found. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating and had to share the story,
No, and the 2 stories that you shared are very fascinating indeed. So when you've interviewed these individuals and others like them, did they ever mention, let me go back, did they ever get visited by anybody, by any organization? I'm not talking about media, but where, I'm not saying they were threatened, but they were encouraged not to share these stories with the public?
Yeah, there's a few different ones, and some have been more nefarious seeming than others. One really quick one was these 2 young guys. They were like 18, 19, and they were roommates. And this was in, the mid 70s, where, huge UFO stuff happening all over the place in the 70s. And this was a couple mornings later, and, not to get into the whole story of the UFO, but with their encounter with this seemingly man in black type figure, he comes to the door, or they hear a knock at the door. One of them goes and answers it, and they describe this guy looking kind of military. He kind of had like a buzz cut, and he was wearing kind of like a military outfit, but with no insignia, but it just looked very, military in nature. And they thought that was kind of weird, but and he starts off kind of nice, and he's like, so are you the guys that saw the UFO? And they're like, oh, yeah, we saw that thing the other night. And he's like, well, you're not going to talk about it with anybody, are you? And started getting really angry. and hostile. And they're like, whoa, okay, yeah, we won't talk about it. And he's like, good. And he just kind of turns around and leaves. And they're like, what the hell? But a much more nefarious encounter happened in Old Orchard Beach in 1976. In Old Orchard Beach is in southern Maine area. And there was this doctor who was providing hypnosis regression therapy to a UFO witness. And one night, after his family leaves to go to a movie, he stayed back. He gets a phone call. And the person on the other line says that they're from this UFO research organization in New Jersey. And they wanted to know if they could come over and talk about the UFO case that he was working on. And the doctor said, yeah, sure. And he hangs up the phone. And the doctor goes to turn on the porch light and to unlock the door for whenever this guest was to arrive. So this was the 70s. It's not like they call from a cell phone or anything. But when he went to go turn on the porch light, there was somebody walking up his stairs. And he felt compelled to open the door. And the visitor said, I'm here to talk to you about the UFOs. And he was kind of in this daze. And he didn't see anything strange in the moment about, okay, why are they here so quickly? I just got off the phone with them. There's no payphone that's so close that they could just walk up the stairs. This is weird. And he just let them into the house, didn't even get his name or anything. So this person comes in and they proceed to talk about the UFO case. But he said that the guy was acting really strange, almost mechanical. And he looked odd. He was wearing this black kind of derby hat, and he was wearing a white button-up shirt and a black blazer and black pants. And he said that the whole suit didn't fit him very well, but it looked brand spanking new. And he also said that when the guy took off his hat, he realized that the guy was completely devoid of hair. There was no eyebrows, there was no eyelashes. He couldn't even see hair follicles on the chin or anything. And he's asking questions about the case, but he's asking them in a weird manner, almost like he doesn't know how to talk. He's asking questions for reference for us, like if AI is talking back to us or something. It seems very robotic and mechanical. Actually, probably AI would do a lot better than this guy. So after a few questions, he said that the man in black or whatever wiped his mouth, and when he did so, the lips smeared. And there was some redness on the fingers, and the lips had smeared on his face. And that said to him that maybe the thing didn't have lips, but it had applied lipstick to make it look like he had lips. And he thought that was strange, but the visitor didn't know that happened, So the guy, the doctor's just trying to keep his cool. And at one point, the talk is going really, it's weird, but it's fine. There's nothing bad happening. But at one point, this mysterious visitor stands up and he tells the doctor to stand up. And he goes, you have 2 coins in your pocket. Put one in your hand. So the doctor puts his hand in his pocket and he feels around. And sure enough, he's got 2 coins. He can tell by the feel of them, one's a dime, one's a penny. So he pulls out the penny. And he's holding it in his hand. And the man in black tells him to watch the penny. So he's watching the penny, and the doctor said, the penny started getting blurry. It then turned into this fuzzy ball. It then got bluish, and then it disappeared. And the doctor was like, wow, that's a neat trick. How did you do that? And the man in black said, if you keep talking about this case and UFOs, that's what's going to happen to your heart.
Holy crap.
Yeah, so that scared the doctor. And then at that point, that man in black said, my energy is running low. I have to go. So the doctor's like, okay, still in kind of a daze. And he opens the door, and he said the stranger was kind of taking one step at a time. He'd put a foot down on the step and then one next to it, put a foot down, then one next to it, and was seeming to have a hard time leaving. So the doctor just kind of watched him walk down the stairs unsteadily. And there was no car or anything there to pick him up. So he's like, all right. So he closes the door. And then there was this bright light, out of nowhere, outside. And he looks. He's like, what the hell was that? And the man in black is gone. And he's like, what? What? I don't understand what happened. And he kind of came back to his senses, and he got immediately scared. And the men in black during this conversation said, you need to destroy all of the audio tapes that you recorded with your sessions and everything, your hypnosis sessions. So the doctor was so scared that he went into his office and he brought all of that stuff out onto the table, and also a gun. So he puts the gun on the table, and he's got all this stuff on the table that has to do with the case. And then finally his family arrives back home. He tells them everything that happened, and they said, you got to destroy that stuff. And he said, that sucks, but okay. So he destroyed everything. And yeah, that's what he claims. The men in black made him stop researching this case.
And one of the images that came to mind, I'm just throwing it out there. If you remember the I think it was 1983 or 4 when NBC came out with that series V.
Oh, okay.
Where these aliens touched down on Earth, but they had masks made of rubber or some sort of plastic to where they ripped out. They were actually reptilians. So that kind of frame came to mind because they're trying to pass off as humans,
right?
And maybe it wasn't very successful. So I know that was a weird tangent, but let me ask you this: so what is the and I can understand from a government perspective to why to keep things secret. Why would an extraterrestrial try to keep these stories to a dull roar? I can't imagine, by us knowing, can we pose a threat to them? I mean, I don't think we would, or we can, but what would be their strategy behind that?
Well, in researching Men in Black in general for some of my work, just so I can speak to, stories that involve Men in Black, and I want some knowledge around that, I found out that there's really like 2 types of Men in Black that get reported. And one of them is kind of like the proto G-man, the military guy that kind of dresses in a nice black suit and has a top hat and wears sunglasses, but they're completely human and they work for the government. And they're kind of trying to bully people into not talking about UFOs. The second kind of Men in Black is the one I just described with that doctor, where they seem to be alien in nature, but have a similar aesthetic in threatening UFO witnesses. And from my research, I find that those also work for the government. So I don't think it's that species plan to keep stuff. There's some sort of arrangement maybe, and they're working with the government to bully witnesses into not talking about UFOs. But again, that's what research is telling me. I have varying levels of belief in all of that, but that's what some of the research is telling me.
Right. And speaking of the researchers, you go back and read articles from the past, and I know we talked about the 70s and 60s. And if we could just touch on one story, because we talked about pre-show about some story back from the 1800s.
Yeah. So one of the first, potentially the very first paranormal investigator in the United States might have been from Maine. And it's a gentleman named Reverend Abraham Cummings. And this was in the late 1800s. And he had heard about this haunting that was going on in this town called Sullivan, Maine. And the haunting is this woman who died giving birth, and her name was Nellie Butler, and that's become a famous ghost story from Maine. And he went to Sullivan to investigate this haunting. And I guess people would a lot of times would hear her like disembodied voice, and sometimes they would see kind of like a woman in white type of thing, or a whitish type of ghost-like image. And he wanted to research and figure out what was going on in this town. And while I was reading his book, he wrote a book about all of his like investigations. And while I was reading this book of his, there was this part of it that really read more like an extraterrestrial encounter as opposed to a ghostly encounter. So I'm reading it, and it says that one evening he's walking through town, And these two guys ran up to him and they said, "Hey, we just ran across this field coming into town to go to the bar. And we saw this weird white thing in a field. And maybe that's Nellie Butler, like we don't know what the hell it is, but we thought we would let you know." And then they kind of leave, And Abraham was like, they're going to the bar. Maybe they've already been drinking already, but this is what I'm here for. So I'll go to the field and check it out. So he walks to the field and he's walking around, looking around. And all of a sudden he sees this white thing off in the distance and he starts walking towards it. And he described it as a large white rock sitting in a field. And it's kind of glowing. And as he's watching this white rock, he says it starts to ascend. And then it hovers. And he's looking at it like, what the hell? He then said that this thing came out of the white rock and came down to the ground. And it was this entity of some sort that was about 3 feet tall. And when he looked at this entity who approached Abraham, he's looking at it, and in his head he's thinking, you don't look like the Nellie Butler that people keep saying that they see. And just as he got done saying that, this thing grew and shapeshifted into kind of like a feminine looking person. But on the top of their head, he said that it was like very glowy, almost like there was a really bright crown, shooting off lights or something on its head. And it said to him, is this more like it, And before he could, say anything else, the next thing he remembers is he's back in his home and he's not in the field anymore. So he runs outside and the entity is gone and the white rock is gone. And he's like, what the hell just happened? And he felt like there was some sort of daze, like he was like, what the hell? And he felt weird, And that's really all he had to say about it, other than, hey, that was a really weird incident. But to me, that really read like some sort of extraterrestrial encounter, and he spoke telepathically with some sort of shape-shifting alien. And there was a missing time thing where they brought him back to his home, Really weird.
An amazing story, indeed. And speaking of amazing stories, I know we're talking about your books and your experience. Let's segue to your podcast because
Sure.
I'm new to the podcast and I recently listened to your latest episode, and it reminds me a lot of the old-time radio plays, well, a little more modern version of it. Very entertaining, and I would suggest to listeners of Let's Find Out to go ahead and take a listen and subscribe. Highly entertaining. How did that podcast start? Are you covering the same topics as what you're writing about in your books? Because you know you do it with your partner, and then sometimes you do solo episodes.
Yeah. Once in a while, I'll cover something that's in the book. But me and my buddy were such fans of the paranormal, that I'm always researching other stuff than UFO stuff. Like a favorite of mine is Black-Eyed Kids and Dogmen, and a lot of stuff like that. So what we like to do is tell stories. So it's kind of like a storytelling podcast. We don't have guests or anything. We just record us telling these stories that we find. And it's called I Want to Believe because, I'm a huge nerd and I love the X-Files. So we named it after the X-Files. But it came about because my buddy and I love to have these long drawn out conversations about paranormal things. And one day, this was about 5 or 6 years ago now, I was like, hey, how about I shove some mics in front of us and we start talking about this stuff on a podcast? And, it's just it's another two bearded white guys with a podcast. Like, what can we really add to the, to the podcast landscape? But, it's a passion project and we like to tell scary stories. And sometimes it's just a solo thing with me. But yeah, we share stories about Black-Eyed Kids, Dogman, ghosts, haunted lighthouses, reincarnation, a whole bunch of different stuff. And we're currently on season 6, and a new episode drops on Saturday. So I'm excited about that.
Can you give us a little taste of what that episode is going to be about?
Yeah, that episode is it's kind of like deviates from the norm, but I gave a talk at a library, and the library happened to record it, and they said, "Hey, would you want this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So I've kind of held on to it for a while, and I just started editing it. So I at this library, I told all these stories, kind of like what I'm telling you now on the show, and I tell this to an audience at a library, and I cut up the stories and I introduce them in real time, and then I let the story play. And there's like 5 or 6 stories that I tell, and that's going to be the latest episode. It's called Nomar Goes to the Library.
Nice. It's going to be like the when you're talking about paranormal, you talk about libraries. The first image that comes to my mind is that scene in Ghostbusters with the library.
Yeah.
And for the listeners of Let's Find Out, now that you have a few books under your belt, you have the podcast. What's next?
I really love content creation in all its forms. I've also made some documentaries, and I keep writing books. I wrote a horror book that came out 2 years ago, and I'm working on a new book. It's called UFOs Over Maine, but it's the 10th anniversary edition. My first book was UFOs Over Maine, and that came out in 2014, and it took me 6 years to write that book. So I started writing it like in 2008 or something. When I first started writing, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I mean, I kind of still don't, but I didn't know what I was doing. So it took a long time to like get a manuscript together, and I found this publisher who was interested, and that's a whole story in itself about finding a publisher and everything. But somebody finally wanted to put it out, and anything that you've done in the past is kind of cringy, for your own personal, take on it. So, I had done this horror book in 2021, and I was really trying to think of like what my next project should be. And I was like, oh man, in 2024, that's going to be the 10-year anniversary of my first book. And there's so many stories just in Maine about UFOs. I'm like, I should really like update that book and re-release it. So I reread my first book, and I'm like, oh my God, this is awful. So what I decided to do was to completely rewrite and revamp that book. The first book had maybe 20, 25 stories. This book is a tome, and it has hundreds of stories in it. It includes all the stories from the original book, but they're all rewritten with additional information. Because when I wrote my first book, I was just getting into this. I didn't know how to interview people. I didn't know how to thoroughly research. So I found all this other great information. I talked to a lot of people from the original stories. And plus I found a ton of other new stuff, like that story with the kids in the classroom. And so I'm really excited about that one. It's kind of going to be like the definitive book on UFOs in Maine, and I'm really excited about it, and it comes out next year. I literally just got done writing it like last week.
Wow, fresh, almost hot off the press. So
yeah.
For the listeners of Let's Find Out, you have your books, you have your podcast, top to bottom. Where can they find your books, and how can they listen? Which platforms can they listen to your podcast on?
Sure. My podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. So, Spotify, Apple, all that good stuff. Just search for I Want to Believe, or I Want to Believe and my name, Nomar Slevik. You can get my books on Amazon. You can just do a Google search for Nomar Slevik books, and all my stuff will come up. If you want to specifically go to a place that super really helps support me as an independent creator, because this is what I do for a living, you can go to slevikstore.company.site, and you can buy books directly from me, and I'll sign them for you and send them out and all that good stuff.
Amazing. I'll be first in line for that one, and please, I will share your link on this episode as well.
Sure.
And let me do this one. Out of all the stories that you've written about in your books, and we're coming up on the clock, if you don't mind, which of those stories is the one that kind of gave you the chills?
There's a story about werewolves that happened in Maine. And when we say werewolves these days, we're mostly talking about dogmen. And this is a dogman story. that occurred, and it happened in 2005. This couple, they're an older couple, and the husband had gotten injured at work and could no longer work, and his wife had to take care of him, so they needed to find more affordable housing. So they found this kind of old farm that they could move to, and the husband could still get around a bit, and he liked to hunt, and he could actually hunt on the property. And they thought that was really great, so he could be mobile but not have to like leave. So one of the nights when they're unpacking everything, the husband sees these weird balls of light out in the woods. And he's like, what the hell is that? And they just look like these little balls of light, and they're kind of bouncing around, through the trees. And he calls his wife over to look at them. And by the time she got there, they were gone. So he's like, geez, I hope that wasn't poachers. Like maybe he was seeing somebody walking with a flashlight or something. So he called his son and his daughter's boyfriend to like come over and like check out the property and, do it during the daylight and see if there's any evidence of anybody, poaching down there, things like that. And they didn't find anything. So this one night, this was maybe a couple of weeks later, he's sitting out on his porch during the evening. It's a routine he and his wife would have. He became quite a night owl after being injured. And they like to sit out on the porch, and she would make a pot of coffee. And they would be out there drinking coffee, and the wife had this high-powered flashlight, and she liked to shine it around the property to like look at deer and find skunk and raccoons and all this stuff. So she's doing this, and her light shines beyond this fence that's, 50 yards in front of them. And she sees this really weird set of eyes. And she thinks it's a deer at first. And as she's shining the light on it, it's just a little too far out where the light can't quite hit it. They're both watching it, and it all of a sudden stands up. And there's a shed nearby, and they said that its head was almost level with the shed, and the shed was about 7 or 8 feet tall. And now that it was standing up, the light was able to shine on the body of this thing that they're looking at. And they described it as like this bipedal, muscular looking person that was covered in hair. And when they shined it on the face, they said that it had like this elongated snout and ears coming up the side of its head. As they're watching this thing, they're terrified, As they're watching this thing, they see 2 more sets of eyes. And it's kind of low down on the fence, almost like deer feeding. And when they look, they start to stand up as well. So now there's 3 of them. And they're just kind of having this staring contest. And then all of a sudden, those creatures like take off and start running like behind the house. So those people run inside, and they actually call the cops. And the cops are really dismissive and said, you call the game wardens, this isn't our deal. So they called the game wardens. And the game wardens took them more seriously. They didn't dispatch anybody to the house, but they made sure to tell them to stay inside and lock the doors. Why the game wardens would give advice like that about wild animals, I don't know, Almost like maybe they've heard of this before, but that's just speculation on my part. Anyways, to make a long story short, they're basically tortured for the entire night with these creatures running around outside. They're banging on the side of the house. They can hear them walking on the roof. And all that's separating them is, flimsy windows and doors that could be broken into. So it was almost like these creatures either didn't know that they could just come crashing through the house, or they just thought it was fun to fuck around with people. I don't know. Yeah. But come morning, they were gone, and there was all this evidence outside with footprints and scratches on the side of the house and things. And it was about a month or 2 later. It took them a little bit of time, but they eventually moved out of the area. I actually went down there last year with my girlfriend, and we checked out the property. It's a pretty cool setup, and you could see maybe there's something in the woods living there,
And I'm thinking that possibly why they were told just to stay home because... And I'm just assuming that perhaps the game wardens heard these stories before and they know damn sure that there's nothing they can do.
Right.
Just stay home and hunker down and let it pass, right?
Right.
So, with that being said, if you don't mind, one more time, the website to purchase your books and also on social media, how can they get a hold of you in case they want to share a story with you?
Yeah, sure. On social media, you can just find me under Nomar Slevik at Instagram and Facebook. It's really the only social media that I have. And the website, if you want to directly help me in purchase anything, it's slevikstore.company.site. But if you don't want to do that, and that's totally okay, just go to Google, search Nomar Slevik books, and you'll find other places to purchase my stuff as well. And it all helps.
It sure does. And my friend, I appreciate you coming on the show. I know you have a very busy schedule. When that 10th anniversary of the book comes out, please come back and let's talk about it. We're gonna do a deep dive and see what's going on.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Hey, I appreciate your time, my friend. And this has been another excellent episode of Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. Check us out on Spotify, Audible, and all of our social media pages. We're on YouTube and also on Rumble. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Until next time, my friends.
My online store is now fully restocked. Granite Skies, check. A Strange Trilogy, check. Otherworldly Encounters, check. And so much more at slevikstore.company.site. Check the show notes for links. Some titles are also available at the Green Hand Bookshop in Portland, Maine, or greenhandbookshop.com.
Thank you for listening to Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. We're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Pocket Casts, and on Anchor. For more information about Let's Find Out with co-host Diego, please visit us on facebook.com/co-host Diego, on Twitter at co-host_Diego, and on Instagram as co-host Diego. Copyright co-host Diego. All content for Let's Find Out is the property of co-host Diego and is served directly from our servers with no modification, redirects, or rehosting. All celebrity impersonators are paid performers. The impersonated celebrities do not endorse or promote any views or opinions expressed by our guests, co-host Diego, or Let's Find Out. The information shared on Let's Find Out is provided on an as-is basis with no guarantees of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness.